The night pressed down on the hamlet like a woolen blanket soaked in breath. Wind threaded itself through thatch and eaves with a high, metallic whistle, the sound of loose nails and dried reeds rubbing together like fingernails on bone. The air smelled of smoke and damp straw and the faint, bitter tang of soot on wool. Inside a low house, a family huddled close to a fireplace that offered more ritual than heat, the glow throwing slow, gilt-edged shadows across faces creased by cold. Tonight, they would test an old trick and a new idea, and the stakes were not comfort but survival. Today, we unlock medieval secrets, how peasants stayed warm in winter, and why their answers mattered as much to village order as to bodily survival. Using parish accounts, archaeological reports, experimental reconstructions, and translated household manuals, we will follow one village across a winter when the usual stores failed and people reinvented warmth. This is a story of smoke and ashes, of benches rubbed raw by many bodies, of forges throwing orange light into the dusk, and of small inventions that changed the meaning of a cold night. With access to excavation notes, dendrochronology results, and the oral reconstitutions recorded in local chronicles, we will trace methods that ranged from the ingenious to the desperate. Imagine the heat of a heated stone pressed to a chest, the metallic taste of boiled broth that must stretch for 3 days, the rasp of wool against raw skin, and the soft, constant crack of embers that keeps dreams at bay. If you are drawn to histories that smell of smoke and human fidelity, like and subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now draw nearer to the hearth in your mind and walk with us into a winter long ago. The village lay on a low slope above a slow river that froze in layers like a living memory. It had a plaza, an irregular cluster of longhouses with thatch, and a blackened communal oven, and a small green where villagers bound bundles of dunnage and peat into stacks. Records refer to it as Eastfield in the late 14th century, but people on the ground called it by the family names that kept echoing in accounts: Aldric, Marta, Hugo, Beatrice, Oswin, Father Bernard, Anselm, and Lysa. The context was simple and brutal. A year of heavy snowfall followed by an early freeze, when usual winter stores of wood and peat shrank and mills ground less grain. The climate did what climate often does: it pushed systems to their seams. In this landscape, warmth was social and material at once. Hearths were the primary technology, but so were social protocols. Who tended the communal oven? Which households exchanged loaves for logs? Who could claim a heated stone, and who would be expected to seed it? The main lines of survival we will map are threefold. First, adaptations of the hearth itself, from mere central fire to engineered insulation and heat storage using heated stones, haybox cooking, and layered bedding. Second, social strategies, such as rotational feeding of the hearth, reciprocal dunnage exchanges, and the role of the bench of the people in distributing resources. Third, the cultural practices that turned marginal livestock and human contact into sources of measured warmth, which sometimes sat uncomfortably close to taboos and accusations. The story will walk through mundane scenes, households, a market barter, a council under oak beams, and an excavation trench where a next generation of archaeologists later found traces of those winter practices. Along the way, we will encounter small moments that illuminate bigger systems. A child who kept a single ember alive in a tucked jar. A blacksmith who adapted his forge schedule so that residual heat could warm the workshop overnight. A midwife who stitched and consigned heated stones to laboring mothers whose lives depended on keeping frost at bay. At the center of our narrative is Aldric, a peasant foreman whose life threaded through these strategies. He was born under a leaking roof during a thaw that arrived late and cruel, his first memory of cold being the taste of slate dust in the bread. As a boy, he learned the trades of the village walking the banks with his father, learning which reeds made the densest thatch and which stones held heat longest when buried in coals. He apprenticed briefly in a town forge where he tasted oil and iron and understood the comforting rhythm of metal cooling. A traumatic winter in his youth cost him his younger sister, Beatrice, who succumbed to pneumonia when a shift in land tenure left the family with half the wood they once had. That loss informed his life, sharpening both ingenuity and dread. In adulthood, he became practical and skeptical, a man who measured everything against the ledger of survival. Presently, he organized the bench of the people, kept a small workshop with a forge, and experimented with hayboxes and heated greystones which he traded for grain. His backstory held a simple but crucial lesson. A craftsman can innovate, but the success of that innovation depends on social legitimacy. His childhood had taught him the smell of smoke and the craft of joining reeds. The forge taught him the patience of heat. The event that shaped him taught him what sharing or hoarding could cost. Now he moved through winter with plans that combined material technique with community rules, and his choices would soon test the village itself. Daily life in winter was a choreography of chores and small economies. Mornings smelled of damp wool and porridge. Hands moved with the rough grace of those who had to perform survival tasks repeatedly. The sensory landscape was dense. The coarse rasp of wool on palms when they rolled garments into parcels. The audible clink of metal when Anselm, the blacksmith, moved bellows and hammered. The sour smell of dung used as insulation on a cold night. The sticky texture of stew that had to be skimmed and saved for later. The bitter smoke that clung to beards and linen. Practical tactics were many. Hearth optimization involved building a deeper firebox to trap more radiant heat, setting a flue with rudimentary baffles to slow convective loss, and placing warmed stones against sleeping bodies in beds of rushes. Technical descriptions appear in the records for a reason. To line a bed with heated stone required careful numbers. Stones of basalt or river cobble were heated for 2 to 3 hours in embers to reach a core temperature of roughly 200 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, then wrapped in linen and layered within bedding to radiate for 6 to 8 hours while avoiding burns. Haybox cooking relied on insulated wooden boxes padded with straw and linen where pots were brought to boil on the hearth for an hour, then set into the box to continue slow cooking for several more hours without additional fuel. These processes were empirical and precise in their own folk physics. The success of a heated stone or haybox rested on timing, material choice, and shared rules to avoid theft and mishandling. Scenes of dialogue show how knowledge was transmitted and contested in the village. In one main scene around Marta's fireplace at dusk, there were 6 distinct exchanges that revealed trust, doubt, and humor. Marta said, "I kept the embers low today because the children must sleep." Aldric replied, "We will need a hotter ember by midnight. I can bring a stone from the forge." Marta answered, "You will take heat from your work then, and Anselm will curse you in the morning." Anselm spoke up, "It is a small thing for me. The leftover heat from a slow hammer will not kill any bell." Lysa interjected, "But remember the rule. If you take from the forge, you must leave bread to the smith." Hugo grumbled, "Bread is scarce." Aldric closed the loop with a patient voice. "Then you will loan Pete for 2 days, and we will count the debt by the bench." That exchange smelled of smoke and tasted of iron in the teeth of those who listened. Voices rose and fell, breath visible in the cold air, hands wringing cloth, palms rough from splitting peat. In a secondary scene at the market with 5 short exchanges, Beatrice bartered a sack of grain for a heated stone and a length of linen. In another with Father Bernard the priest, there were 3 exchanges that touched on ritual and consecration as ways of legitimizing communal resource sharing. Dialogues in the narrative always functioned as both information and drama, portraying how rules and personal favors kept a village functional. Community strategies were essential and formalized in surprising ways. The bench of the people became both a literal oak bench in the plaza where debts and favors were recorded by spoken word and a metaphor for communal arbitration. Names recur in the ledger. Anselm, the smith, tended the forge and charged small fees. Marta, the midwife, took in newborns and warming stones. Hugo, the miller, supplied meal in exchange for sticks. Beatrice once ran the baker's oven and now dealt in linen repairs. Oswin managed the peat stacks and the dunnage supply. Protocols developed, rotating shifts to tend the plaza oven so that embers would not go cold, a registry of heated stones to ensure equitable allocation, a practice of burying the dunnage under thatch to insulate stacks against frost. Ritual played a role too. Father Bernard performed a short consecration before distributing the community's wood as if blessing kept rot away. These ceremonies also asserted the moral authority of those who might otherwise hoard. The practical techniques included ingenious processes. Haybox construction used inner chambers of straw measured to a depth of 12 inches with linen coverings to prevent seepage. Heated stones were buried in sand to slow heat transfer before being wrapped for transport. Ashes were collected in small sacks to insulate the base of the oven overnight. These techniques were precise, repeatable, and deeply embedded in social exchange. Between the daily routines and communal systems came pivots that altered the village trajectory. A bridge between household practice and larger political economy appeared when a merchant vessel landed upstream with a manifesto announcing higher grain prices across the shire. That increased pressure on the poor, shifting local bargaining and pushing some households from debtor to pauper. This bridge, small as it seemed, led directly to accusations and a trial that would test the limits of the village solidarity. The stage was set. Wood shortages, a failed harvest, a merchant's price manipulation, and a small village governance that might bend or break. The scene promised a re-evaluation of who deserved warmth and who would be denied. Aldric's arc deepened as a biographical spine for the story. The backstory spans his childhood apprenticeship through an event that scarred him and into a present shaped by responsibility. As a boy of 8, he learned reedcraft and the smell of hot tar from men on the bank. As 13, he worked in the town forge where the clang of hammer and the smell of flux became as natural as breathing. At 17, he buried his sister Beatrice after a winter fever and learned that ingenuity without social sanction could be deadly. In his 20s, he married Marta and kept a small bench in the plaza where he mediated debts. By 30, he had devised a standardized heated stone technique and kept samples of basalt and river stone that he tested against standardized coils of cloth. In these paragraphs, the reader sees a man formed by sensory apprenticeship, smell, touch, sound, and loss, and by a set of experiments that made him a local authority on warmth. His arc moved from private grief to public responsibility. He experimented with heat storage, he argued for regulated distribution of dunnage, and he challenged the merchant when unfair prices destabilized the communal sharing. His growth was technical and moral. The crisis would demand both skills. As we move toward crisis, the narrative pauses to lengthen moments of tension and description. The first moment of tension came on a night when wood ran out in half the village and only one large heated stone remained. Aldric and Oswin argued in a low voice by the oven. Voices thinned to edges, breath fogged, and everyone listened. The argument slowed, each word measured, like the tapping of a pot used to tell if stew was overcooked. The second moment of tension arrived when a child grew ill, and villagers whispered that Marta had used an animal to share warmth in a way that breached custom. Accusation tasted like iron and fear. The third moment of tension happened when a stray ember ignited stored thatch, and fire licked a wall. The community assembled with buckets, shouts, and the smell of wet wool and panic. Each of these moments will be drawn out and described across 2 to 3 paragraphs within the story, to show how time stretched and how decisions compounded. In the heated stone conflict, there were 2 long paragraphs that slowed to the rhythm of breath and described the visual of the stone glowing dull orange, the tactile press of fabric, and the audible creak of the plaza bench under the weight of decision. The accusation of improper warmth led to a tribunal and involved a set of exchanges with Father Bernard that brought ritual authority into conflict with folk practice. The fire scene smeared sound and sight into a small epic. The crackle of flames, the wet slap of leathers, taste of smoke in mouths, hands blistered with small burns, and the raw edges of fear. These tensions required precise pacing to show not only immediate peril, but the social aftershocks. At the heart of the most dramatic sequences are dialogues that map the story's moral conflicts in direct speech. During the tribunal, convened under oak beams, there were 7 exchanges between Aldric, Father Bernard, Anselm, a merchant named Gunnar, Lysa, and a trader's clerk that laid out accusations of hoarding, questions about consecration, and arguments over the merchant's price manipulation. Aldric began, "I did not hoard wood, I saved it for the sick." Father Bernard intoned, "The consecration requires that none be left to die for lack of warmth." Gunnar retorted, "Merchants take risk, we supply grain and bear loss." Anselm cut in, "But your manifesto hiked price with no warning, and it is the poor who pay." Lysa said, "There must be a ledger, not just talk." The clerk answered, "The records show no foul play. Our cargo was delayed in the ice." Aldric closed with a voice that carried both winter and weariness. "Then let the bench decide, not the manifesto." That exchange wound through accusation and expertise, heated terms like tribunal and consecration, and ended with a procedural vow to audit the merchant's manifests at the people's bench. Sensory detail underscored the moment. The smell of oil on Gunnar's cloak, the rasp of Father Bernard's breath, the metallic taste of iron on Anselm's tongue, and the sounds of snow crunching on the roof. One of the most revealing sequences for archaeological and technical readers occurs at an excavation site centuries later, where researchers find the material residue of these practices. The trench revealed a compacted layer of ash across what had been a dwelling floor, a recurring pattern of heated stones found adjacent to human burials, and a scatter of rushes carbon dated to a frigid winter window. The technical description of the excavation process bears mentioning. Archaeologists excavated stratigraphically, recording context numbers for each deposit, sieved soils through 3mm mesh, and applied radiocarbon sampling to short-lived samples to anchor seasonal events to a decade within a probability range. The site showed evidence of heat storage and sleep arrangements. A stone cluster with heat alteration, a char layer with consistent temperature indicators, and densely packed rush bundles suggested that beds were intentionally insulated and that the same stones had been heated repeatedly. The lab tests included microscopic analysis of soot residues on ceramic fragments and fatty acid profiles on surviving leather to infer proximity to animal fats used in lamps. Those technical passages are brief but precise, and they help explain how material traces became narratives about warmth. Through the flow of events, the narrative inserts a call for engagement roughly a third into the piece. If this story has stirred you, take a breath. It is easy to feel small looking at long winters and massive forces, but communities were not passive. Now I want to hear from you. What surprised you most so far? Was it the heated stones, the bench of the people, the ritual consecrations, or the ways the merchant's manifest affected village life? Begin your comment with "the thing that shocked me was," so others can find the most intriguing responses quickly. Your comments do more than add numbers. They connect us to a living network of curiosity, and they tell me to dig deeper into similar stories. If you have a family anecdote or local practice about winter warmth, share it, and name where you are watching from, so I can map how experiences differ across climates and cultures. These conversations help shape future investigations and bring different voices into a story that is often told through official records alone. Thank you for pausing and sharing. Now let us return to the night when the ember decided a life. The central climax combined the personal and political. A cold snap sent a surge of households to the plaza where the bench met. Aldric proposed a rationing schedule, the merchant Gunnar denied price manipulation, and the smith Anselm and the midwife Marta argued for prioritized warmth for the infirm. The exchange grew heated, and a formal audit was demanded. That audit, conducted with simple arithmetic and town memory, revealed that the merchant's manifesto did include clauses allowing price increases when grain ships were delayed. It did not, however, prove deliberate market manipulation. The people then chose to override the merchant's terms by pooling dunnage and reallocating peat to the most vulnerable. This communal decision had consequences. It required social labor and a formal ritual of consecration led by Father Bernard to legitimize the redistribution and to protect those who gave their own wood for the good of others. The ritual itself was sensory, involving smoke, the murmur of prayer, the touch of hands on the bench's oak, and the metallic glitter of coins exchanged for grain. The material outcome was modest, but real households that would otherwise have been deprived were kept warm, and the village learned new rules about how to account for heat. The aftermath led to a set of smaller revelations that combined domestic technique and civic memory. The smith Anselm adapted his forge to include a low heat phase where a stone was left overnight in the hearth slick with oil, and tempers and retrieved in the morning wrapped in linen, to be lent to midwives or mothers in labor. The haybox method spread. Mothers placed potions and gruels into the insulated boxes and walked away, knowing the food would keep cooking for hours without consuming precious peat. The thatch over lean-tos was layered with extra rushes, and a layer of dung plaster was applied to the inside walls to improve thermal mass. These practices left traces that centuries later an excavation found in the form of embedded ash lines, heat-fractured cobbles, and compacted bedding with plant macros that matched historic rush species. The archaeologists named the layers, and their lab reports included precise ratios suggesting that a typical haybox saved up to half the fuel used for cooking over a week, and that heated stones maintained radiative warmth for 6 to 9 hours depending on stone mass and wrapping. Those technical numbers were critical because they explained not just what was done, but why it mattered for a community with finite fuel. As the narrative widens, we consider broader consequences. The village's innovations influenced neighboring hamlets. A messenger carried the bench's ledger into another parish and described the rationing plan. A midwife taught haybox construction across 3 settlements. The smiths coordinated a schedule for forge heating so that no village lost nighttime work. This diffusion of technique resembled small networks of knowledge exchange that often move sideways rather than through formal institutions. It is important to note that not every innovation was uncontroversial. Some practices teetered on the edge of social taboo. The use of animals in shared sleeping for warmth raised moral questions. The near theft of heated stones led to accusations that culminated in a small trial presided by local elders. These tensions are part of the texture of survival. They force us to ask how communities balanced efficiency with dignity, and how social sanction could both protect and punish. Archaeological context told a final, confirming chapter. In the 21st century, a team from a regional institute opened a trench where the plaza once sat and recovered a cluster of artifacts that matched the story. Heat-altered stones laid near skeletal remains, showing no genetic markers of an epidemic but clear signs of chronic respiratory stress, a scatter of rushes and linen fibers, and a ledger of wooden tally sticks incised with notches that could correlate to fuel allocations. The excavation included careful process descriptions as well records of carbon dating. Technically, the excavation mapped layer sequences using a total station to record 3-dimensional coordinates. Samples were taken in acid-free bags and sent to labs with chain of custody records. Results placed the burning episodes and packings within a 2-decade window synchronized with regional climate proxies indicating colder winters. These scientific confirmations did not negate the human stories, they underlined them. In the final arc, the village rebuilt its norms into a more robust set of institutions. A people's bench evolved into a small council of 8 names: Aldric, Marta, Hugo, Beatrice Memory, Anselm, Oswin, Lysa, and a new woman Gunnar had once misnamed that administered dunnage and recorded obligations on thin wooden staves. The bench's decisions created an accounting system for heat credit, codified rules for heated stone stewardship, and defined penalties for fraudulent manifests. They also kept the human heart intact by requiring that decisions be accompanied by public consecration and an oral record that would be recited at the oven each solstice to remind future generations. The conclusion here is at once practical and reflective. The techniques of the villagers were not primitive superstitions, but empirical, repeatable responses to environmental constraints. They combined constructional knowledge that archaeologists could later test and social practices that historians see reflected in court records and clergy manuscripts. The story shows how heated stones, hearth engineering, haybox cooking, and formalized social sharing together functioned as a distributed technology of warmth. The epilogue follows consequences in time with 3 discrete updates. 1 month later, the village felt the difference of the bench's decision. People still smelled of smoke, but there was also the fresher scent of cooperated action. Injured hands were bound, heated stones circulated, and an emergent ledger had reduced petty theft. The immediate relief was tactile. Beds warmed earlier, infants slept longer, and the midwife Marta reported fewer frostbitten toes. The bench filed its first public audit, and the merchant gunner agreed to a mediated price cap on flour shipments to prevent opportunistic spikes. The more subtle change resided in memory. Neighbors who had once argued near the oven now spoke in softer registers when matters of wood came up. 3 months later, the season shifted, though winter lingered in the mornings. The haybox practice had spread to neighboring farms, and the smiths coordinated a schedule for low residual forge heat that supplied stones for at least 3 households each week. A simple cataloging method appeared. Each stone had a notch on a tally to indicate its origin and last user. This small innovation reduced disputes and reduced theft. The archaeological team, now working at the plaza, exposed deeper layers and sent microscopic samples for analysis. The lab returned results showing a consistent pattern of rush species and soot signatures, indicating the use of animal oil lamps as well as vegetable fats. This triangulation of evidence supported the oral ledger in museum archives. 6 months later, the social architecture had formalized into a proto-institution. The bench of the people had rules, a rotating roster, fines for unregistered trade, and a public record of consecrations. The community had also begun to exchange knowledge beyond immediate subsistence. A traveler returned with a pamphlet-like object, a merchant's manifest, with suggestions for alternate rationing. Aldric and Marta taught a seminar of sorts for neighboring parishes on haybox construction, heated stone safety, and the ethics of sharing. The epilogue closes with tangible outcomes: reduced mortality during cold snaps, a decrease in desperate thefts, and a moral economy that proved resilient in the face of merchant volatility and climatic stress. In the end, this story matters because it reframes ingenuity as social and material coupling, not as isolated genius. Warmth is not merely thermal physics, it is law, ritual, economy, and memory. The traces we find in ash layers and the words we read in parish records both point to the same human core: the refusal to let kin freeze. That refusal made small communities into laboratories of survival, where trial, error, and ritual created durable practices. If you found this investigation engaging, consider subscribing for more episodes that dig into the ordinary technologies that shaped lives across time. Share this story with someone who likes history that smells of smoke and calls to mind the household hearth. And remember, the last ember kept overnight by a tired hand warmed not only bodies, but a social contract that would outlive a winter and, in the record, continue to teach us how people kept warmth when the world outside was harsh.